WWI.
Friends, before we begin this journey into the very dawn of human warfare, take a moment to subscribe to Echoes of History. Your support keeps this channel alive, and together we will uncover the forgotten echoes of the past. Now, let us travel thousands of years back, far beyond modern armies, beyond the empires of Rome, Persia, or China, into a world where the very idea of war was just being born. The question before us is simple, yet profound. When did the first war in human history truly begin? And who, if anyone, could be called the victor? Human beings have fought and killed each other since the beginning of time. But a war is something different from a quarrel or a skirmish. War means organized violence. Groups against groups, clans against clans, tribes against tribes. It means planning, weapons, leaders, and the decision not just to kill, but to dominate and claim resources or land. Archaeologists and historians agree, the very first evidence of such organized warfare lies in the Stone Age. Around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, as the Ice Age ended, humans shifted from nomadic hunting and gathering to the beginnings of settled farming. Villages appeared. Land became valuable. Rivers and fertile soil meant food security. And with that food came envy, rivalry, and the desire to seize what another group had. War was born not out of hatred alone, but out of survival. One of the earliest known battlefields in the world is Jebel Sahaba, near the Nile in present-day Sudan. Archaeologists discovered a cemetery here dating back almost 13,000 years. The bones tell a chilling story. Many skeletons carried arrowheads embedded in them, skulls crushed by clubs, limbs broken by blunt weapons. These people did not die by accident. They were slain in conflict, one tribe attacking another, leaving behind the silent testimony of the first known massacre in human history. Close your eyes and imagine that scene, two groups of hunter-gatherers facing each other along the Nile. Spears sharpened with stone tips, bows strung with sinew, men painted with earth and ash, women and children fleeing behind them. The clash would not have looked like modern battles with ranks and formations. It was raw chaos, arrows flying, screams echoing across the desert, blood spilling on the sand. And when it was over, bodies lay scattered, some left unburied, others carried to graves. This was war before nations, before kings, before written history. But the story does not end there. As farming societies grew, conflicts grew larger. Around 4000 BCE, In the Mesopotamian plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, today's Iraq, humans built the world's first cities: Uruk, Lagash, Kish. These early city-states quickly found themselves in rivalry. Who would control the rivers? Who would command the fertile farmlands? And who would tax the trade caravans moving between them? By around 2700 BCE, inscriptions carved into stone tablets tell us of one of the earliest recorded wars between the city-states of Lagash and Umma. These weren't nameless tribes anymore. These were organized armies, led by kings, protected by gods they worshipped, and supported by entire populations. Inscriptions speak of borders disputed, irrigation canals seized, and temples violated. In one famous stele, known as the Stele of the Vultures, the king of Lagash is shown leading his soldiers, armed with spears and shields, trampling the enemy of Umma beneath their feet. It is both art and propaganda, but it reveals something astonishing. By 2500 BCE, humanity had already invented armies, strategies, and the language of conquest. This, we can say, was one of the first true wars in recorded history. It was no longer a sudden raid or ambush. It was planned, chronicled, remembered. Thousands must have fought, hundreds must have died. And the winner wrote his story in stone, so that all who came after would know, we won, and the gods favored us. So, who won the world's first war? If we look to Lagash and Umma, the evidence suggests Lagash triumphed, at least for a time. Their king, Enatum, claimed divine support and boasted that he crushed his enemies. But history teaches us that no victory is permanent. Soon enough, Lagash itself would fall to other powers, and the cycle of war would continue. Let us pause here. Think about what this means. The first wars were not fought by nations or empires. They were fought by people like us, desperate to protect their homes, hungry for survival, and eager to prove their gods were stronger. These wars were messy, brutal, and short-lived, but they planted the seed of something that would grow for millennia. From tribal raids in the Stone Age to the wars of Mesopotamia, humanity had crossed a line it would never uncross. We had discovered the organized killing of war. And yet, there is a haunting question: did anyone truly win? The skeletons at Jebel Sahaba do not tell us of victors. They only show the cost of violence: children pierced with arrows, men and women struck down, entire groups wiped out. In a sense, the first war in history was not won by any tribe or city. It was won by war itself. From that moment on, war became a permanent companion of civilization. The bones of Jebel Sahaba and the carved stones of Lagash told us one truth: war had become a permanent shadow of human civilization. Now, as we step beyond those first sparks, we enter the age of kingdoms and empires, where war was no longer just about survival, but about power, territory, and the hunger to rule. In Mesopotamia, the rivalry of city-states never truly ended. After Lagash and Umma clashed, new leaders rose to claim dominance. By around 2330 BCE, a remarkable man appeared, Sargon of Akkad. He built what historians call the world's first empire, the Akkadian Empire. But an empire is not born without war. To unite Mesopotamia, Sargon waged campaign after campaign, subduing the cities of Sumer, conquering lands far beyond the rivers, and enforcing his rule with the sword. His soldiers marched in formation, wielding bronze-tipped spears and battle axes, supported by chariots drawn by donkeys. The Akkadian armies were organized, disciplined, and ruthless. For the first time in history, warfare had a face that we would recognize today. Campaigns that lasted years, professional armies loyal to a ruler, logistics of supplies and roads, even propaganda carved on steles and statues. Sargon's victories marked not just battles but the beginning of imperial war, the kind that would echo for millennia across every continent. Yet Mesopotamia was not alone. To the west, along the Nile, another power was rising, ancient Egypt. And Egypt, too, had its wars. The early pharaohs fought against Nubians to the south and Libyans to the west. But Egypt's most dramatic clashes came later, during the New Kingdom, when pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II led massive armies across the deserts into the Levant. Take the year 1274 BCE. On the plains near a city called Kadesh, the Egyptian forces of Ramses II faced the mighty Hittite Empire. It was one of the earliest battles in history for which we have detailed records. Ramses rode in a chariot, his soldiers armed with bows and spears, banners fluttering in the wind. The Hittites, too, brought their chariots, crashing into the Egyptian lines like a storm. The clash was brutal, chaotic, and immense, thousands of warriors, dust clouds rising, arrows blackening the sky. Both sides claimed victory, but in truth, neither could destroy the other. The Battle of Kadesh ended in a stalemate, but it gave us something just as important, the world's first known peace treaty. Think about that. Humanity's first wars were about blood and conquest, but only 1,000 years later, humans had also learned to negotiate peace. War and peace, death and survival, had become the rhythm of civilization. But let us return to our central question: what was the world's first war? Was it the massacre at Jebel Sahaba? Was it the clash between Lagash and Umma? Or should we say it was the great battles of empires like Akkad and Egypt? The answer is layered. Archaeologists might point to skeletons pierced by arrows and say, "Here lies the evidence of the first war." Historians might hold up the steel of the vultures and say, "Here is the first recorded war." And political scientists might argue that only when states and empires fought organized campaigns can we truly call it a war. What is clear is this: once humanity discovered farming, property, and organized societies, war became inevitable. And once kings and pharaohs rose, war became grand, terrifying, and unforgettable. Across the world, other regions were experiencing their own first wars. In the Indus Valley, rival cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro may have clashed, though evidence is faint. In China, the early Shang dynasty fought brutal battles, their warriors carrying bronze weapons and riding horse-drawn chariots. In the Americas, centuries later, the Olmec and Mayan peoples would also learn the language of war. But the heart of our story remains here, in Mesopotamia and Egypt, where the seeds of organized war blossomed into the first great conflicts. These wars were no longer about small tribes. They were about nations, gods, and legacies carved into stone. And yet, the haunting truth remains: who really won? Did Sargon's victories create lasting peace? No. Within a century, his empire collapsed. Did Ramses secure everlasting glory at Kadesh? Perhaps in poems and temples, but the Hittites remained strong. In the end, the first wars of history reveal a timeless lesson. War grants glory to kings for a season, but it leaves behind ruins, graves, and questions that echo forever. The ancient world seemed unstoppable. Empires like Egypt, the Hittites, and the great cities of Mesopotamia stood tall, their temples shining with gold, their armies marching under banners of gods. Trade routes stretched across seas and deserts, carrying copper, tin, grain, and luxuries from one land to another. But in the 12th century BCE, something extraordinary happened. Civilizations that had stood for centuries suddenly crumbled. Palaces were burned, cities abandoned, and the world entered a dark age. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse. And at the heart of this collapse was war. What caused this catastrophe? The answers are many, and still debated. But the evidence shows invasions, famines, earthquakes, and rebellions striking one after another. A mysterious people, remembered in Egyptian inscriptions as the Sea Peoples, swept across the Mediterranean, destroying kingdoms in their path. Picture the scene. Fleets of ships with strange prows appear on the horizon. Warriors with bronze swords, round shields, and horned helmets leap ashore. They sack cities, burn temples, and leave smoking ruins behind them. The mighty Hittite Empire was wiped from history. The city of Ugarit, once a thriving hub of trade, was reduced to ashes. Even Egypt, under Pharaoh Ramses III, barely survived, fighting desperate battles along the Nile Delta to repel these invaders. War was no longer between neighboring cities or rival kings. Now it came in waves, like storms from the sea, uprooting entire civilizations. For the first time, humanity experienced what we might call total war, not just armies clashing, but societies collapsing. The consequences were devastating. Literacy declined, trade networks vanished, and many regions entered centuries of poverty and isolation. This was not just the fall of kingdoms. It was the death of an entire world order. And again, we must ask, who won? The Sea Peoples who burned cities? The survivors who held their ground? Or war itself, which swept the board clean? Yet even in this darkness, the seeds of future power were sown. New peoples rose from the ruins. The Assyrians in Mesopotamia began to build an empire through relentless military campaigns. They perfected the art of siege warfare, using battering rams, towers, and iron weapons to smash the walls of their enemies. Their brutality was legendary. Conquered people were deported, rebels flayed alive, and entire cities erased from maps. To the Assyrians, war was not just survival. It was a tool of terror, a deliberate strategy to control the world. By the first millennium BCE, the Assyrians were unmatched. Their armies marched in formations, with iron swords and spears gleaming in the sun, backed by cavalry and chariots. They became the model of what a true war machine looked like. For centuries, they crushed rivals from Babylon to Egypt, writing their victories in blood. But even they could not escape the truth. Every empire that rises will one day fall. By 612 BCE, the great city of Nineveh was itself besieged and destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. Once again, war had devoured its own masters. As we trace these stories, a pattern emerges. From Jebel Sahaba to Lagash, from Kadesh to the Sea Peoples, from Assyria to Babylon, war grows larger, deadlier, and more organized. Humanity learns new technologies: bronze, iron, the chariot, the bow, and each innovation only feeds the fire of conflict. And so, when we ask, what was the world's first war, and who won? The answer grows more complex. The first wars were tribal, then city-based, then imperial. The winners gained land, gold, and glory, but the price was always heavy: death, destruction, and collapse. The Bronze Age collapse shows us the deepest irony: war can destroy not just enemies, but the very fabric of civilization. Those who burned cities may have celebrated, but in the ashes that followed, entire generations lived poorer, harder lives. As the dust of the Bronze Age collapse settled, new civilizations rose from the ashes. By the 8th century BCE, the Mediterranean was alive with energy again. Small city-states, proud and independent, emerged in Greece. To the east, the Persians were forging one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. And soon, the clash between these two worlds would give us some of the most famous wars in history. Let us begin in Greece. Unlike the mighty empires of Mesopotamia or Egypt, Greece was not a single kingdom but a collection of city-states: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and many others. Each had its own government, culture, and identity. Sometimes they fought each other, sometimes they stood together. But their way of fighting was unlike anything the world had seen before. The Greeks fought in phalanxes, tight formations of heavily armored soldiers called hoplites. Each hoplite carried a large round shield and a spear, standing shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. It was a wall of men and bronze, advancing steadily, crushing anything in its path. War, for the Greeks, was not just about kings or empires. It was about citizens, farmers, craftsmen, and landowners, taking up arms to defend their city. But Greece was not alone in the world. Far to the east, the Persian Empire had risen under Cyrus the Great and later Darius I. The Persians ruled lands stretching from India to Egypt, a vast domain connected by roads and commanded by kings who saw themselves as masters of the world. Inevitably, Persia's expansion brought it into conflict with tiny, defiant Greece. The first great clash came in 490 BCE at the Battle of Marathon. The Persians landed on the coast of Greece with tens of thousands of troops, expecting an easy victory. The Athenians, outnumbered, marched out to meet them. At dawn, they charged across the plain, their hoplite phalanxes crashing into the Persian lines. Against all odds, the Athenians triumphed. The story goes that a messenger ran from Marathon to Athens, about 26 miles, to announce the victory before collapsing, the inspiration for today's marathon race. But Persia was not finished. 10 years later, in 480 BCE, King Xerxes launched a massive invasion, perhaps the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, supported by a fleet of warships, marched into Greece. And here, legend was born. At a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, a small force led by King Leonidas of Sparta held the pass against the Persian horde. For 3 days, the Spartans and their allies fought fiercely, their bronze shields and spears blocking wave after wave of Persian attacks. Eventually, betrayal revealed a secret path, and the Spartans were surrounded. Leonidas and his men fought to the death, their sacrifice immortalized in history as a symbol of courage against impossible odds. Though the Persians advanced, the Greeks did not give up. At sea, the Athenian navy lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis. There, the smaller, faster Greek ships outmaneuvered the massive Persian vessels, sinking many of them. Xerxes, watching from his throne on a cliff, saw his fleet destroyed. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, the Greeks once again defeated the Persians on land. Against all expectation, tiny Greece had stopped the greatest empire of its age. These wars were not just battles of swords and shields. They were clashes of worlds, an empire of kings versus a people who prized freedom and self-rule. And in their victory, the Greeks gave us more than stories. They preserved the space in which ideas like democracy, philosophy, and science could flourish. But victory did not mean peace. Soon, Greece turned on itself. Athens, proud and powerful after the Persian Wars, clashed with Sparta in a conflict known as the Peloponnesian War, 431–404 BCE. This was no short campaign. It lasted nearly 30 years, with sieges, naval battles, and betrayals tearing the Greek world apart. Athens fell, its democracy shaken, and Sparta stood triumphant, only to decline soon after. Once again, the question haunts us: in war, who truly wins? Yet the story of Greece did not end in ruin. From the north, a new force rose, Macedonia. Under King Philip II and his son Alexander the Great, Macedon united Greece and launched a campaign that would shake the world. Alexander marched east, defeating Persia at battles like Issus and Gaugamela, conquering lands all the way to India. His armies spread Greek culture far and wide, creating the Hellenistic world, a fusion of East and West. With Alexander, war reached a new scale. His strategies, rapid movements, combined arms of cavalry and infantry, and bold risks, became lessons for generals even thousands of years later. But Alexander's empire, like those before it, crumbled after his death. His generals carved it into pieces, and once again, war devoured its own victories. Looking at Greece and Persia, one thing is clear: war had now become not just survival or power, but ideology. The Greeks fought for their city-states, their freedom, their way of life. The Persians fought to expand empire and enforce order. Both sides achieved glory, but both paid in blood. As the echoes of Greece faded across the Mediterranean, another power slowly began to rise, one that would master war in a way the world had never seen before. Its name was Rome. What began as a small city on the banks of the Tiber River would grow into an empire spanning 3 continents, ruling for centuries, and leaving a legacy that still shapes our world today. And at the heart of Rome's rise was war. Rome's earliest conflicts were modest, skirmishes with neighboring tribes in central Italy. But even then, the Romans showed something unique. an unbreakable discipline and an almost religious devotion to the state. For them, war was not just survival. It was duty. Every citizen who owned land was expected to serve. The Roman army was not a band of warriors but an organized force built on training, loyalty, and relentless persistence. By the 4th century BCE, Rome had subdued much of Italy. But the true test came in the Punic Wars, a series of epic struggles against Carthage, a powerful city-state in North Africa. Carthage controlled vast trade networks across the Mediterranean, and its greatest general, Hannibal Barca, would become one of history's most brilliant commanders. In 218 BCE, Hannibal led an army, including war elephants, across the Alps into Italy, a feat so daring it stunned the ancient world. At battles like Cannae, he crushed Roman legions with tactics still studied by modern generals, surrounding a larger enemy and destroying it completely. At Cannae, nearly 50,000 Romans were killed in a single day. For a moment, Rome seemed doomed. And yet, Rome did not break. Unlike other nations that collapsed after a few defeats, Rome endured. They raised new armies, year after year, refusing to surrender. Eventually, under the leadership of Scipio Africanus, Rome struck back. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Hannibal was finally defeated, and Carthage's power was broken. From that victory, Rome's empire building accelerated. They conquered Greece, absorbed the rich lands of Egypt, and extended their legions across Spain, Gaul, and Britain. Wherever they went, they built roads, aqueducts, and cities, but also left battlefields filled with blood. The Roman legion was the most formidable fighting force of its age. Unlike the Greek phalanx, the legion was flexible. Small units called maniples could move independently, adapting to terrain and enemy tactics. Soldiers carried short swords, the gladius, and large shields, using discipline and coordination to overwhelm foes. Rome's genius lay not just in weapons but in organization, training, engineering, and the ability to fight year after year without rest. But Rome's greatest wars were not only against outsiders, they were also against itself. Civil war would eventually bring down the Republic. In the 1st century BCE, generals like Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus turned their armies against each other in a struggle for power. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul had already shown Rome's unmatched ferocity, as entire tribes were wiped out or enslaved. But when he crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, marching on Rome itself, war came home. The civil wars tore the Republic apart. Caesar triumphed but was assassinated soon after. His heir, Octavian, later Augustus, emerged as Rome's first emperor. The Republic was gone, and in its place stood an empire ruled by a single man. Under the emperors, Rome reached its peak. Its legions marched into Britain, clashed with Germanic tribes along the Rhine, and fought the great empire of Parthia in the east. Roman wars were fought on every frontier, deserts, mountains, and forests. The empire became a machine of conquest, feeding itself with tribute, slaves, and glory. But once again, the question lingers: who truly won? Carthage was destroyed, Greece absorbed, Gaul subdued. Yet Rome's victories came at a cost. Entire peoples were exterminated, millions enslaved, and constant warfare drained the lifeblood of the empire. By the 3rd century CE, Rome itself was crumbling under the weight of endless war, invaded by barbarian tribes, torn by usurpers, and weakened by its own ambition. The story of Rome shows us the double edge of war. On one hand, it built the greatest empire of the ancient world, spreading roads, laws, and culture that still influence us today. On the other, it destroyed countless lives, leaving ruins where thriving civilizations once stood. And in the end, Rome too fell. In 476 CE, the last Roman emperor in the West was deposed, and the ancient empire was gone. What remained were broken walls, faded roads, and memories of glory written in blood. War had built Rome, and war had unmade it. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, Europe entered what many call the Middle Ages. The once mighty roads of Rome crumbled, cities shrank, and kingdoms rose and fell in rapid succession. But one thing did not vanish: war. It merely changed its face. In this new age, war was shaped by castles, knights, and faith. Power was fragmented. Kings controlled lands through nobles, and nobles through vassals. Each promised loyalty in exchange for land and protection. But loyalty was fragile, and disputes were constant. War was not only about empires now, but also about feudal rivalries, family claims, and religion. The symbol of this era was the knight. Clad in chainmail, later in shining plate armor, a knight rode a warhorse into battle with lance, sword, and shield. These warriors were bound by codes of honor, yet their world was drenched in violence. Castles, built with towering walls and moats, became both homes and fortresses, their stones scarred by sieges and battering rams. And then came the wars of faith, the Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II called upon Christian knights to march to the Holy Land and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. What followed was nearly 2 centuries of bloody campaigns. Armies of crusaders, bearing crosses on their tunics, marched across Europe and the Middle East. They clashed with Muslim dynasties like the Seljuks and later the mighty Saladin, who retook Jerusalem in 1187. The Crusades were more than just battles. They were brutal encounters of civilizations. Villages were burned, populations slaughtered, and holy cities soaked in blood. Yet they also brought cultural exchange, ideas, technologies, and trade between East and West. War, once again, both destroyed and connected the world. Meanwhile, in Europe itself, dynasties fought endless struggles. The Hundred Years' War between England and France 1337–1453 showed how medieval war could devastate nations. It was not one war, but a series of campaigns spanning generations. At battles like Agincourt, English longbowmen cut down French knights in their heavy armor, showing that even the proudest warrior could be felled by a simple arrow. But beyond Europe, other powers were rising. In the East, the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, battled enemies from Persians to Turks. To the north, Vikings sailed in longships, raiding and conquering with axes and fire, striking terror from Britain to Russia. And then came a storm from the steppes, the Mongols. In the 13th century, under Genghis Khan, they built the largest land empire in history. Their horsemen moved faster than any army before them, striking with composite bows, coordinated maneuvers, and brutal efficiency. Entire cities surrendered in fear, those who resisted were annihilated. The Mongols reshaped Asia and reached deep into Europe, leaving trails of destruction but also forging new connections. Along the Silk Road, in every corner of the world, war was evolving. Gunpowder, invented in China, began to spread westward, changing the very nature of combat. Cannons smashed castle walls that once seemed impenetrable. The knight on horseback, once invincible, was slowly becoming obsolete in the face of disciplined infantry and new weapons. But amid all this, the same question echoes: who won? The Crusaders seized Jerusalem for a time, but lost it again. England captured French lands, but France eventually triumphed. The Mongols built a vast empire, but it fractured within a century. Victory in war was always temporary. The suffering, however, endured for generations. The Middle Ages remind us that war is not only about empires but about identity, faith, and survival. Castles stand as ruins today, their stones silent witnesses to centuries of sieges. And the stories of knights, crusaders, and conquerors still echo, tales of bravery, cruelty, and the unending human hunger for power. As the Middle Ages faded, a new dawn began in Europe, the Renaissance. It was a time of art, science, and discovery, but it was also an age of new wars, deadlier than ever before. The invention of gunpowder weapons changed everything. No longer could knights in armor dominate the battlefield. No longer could castles stand invincible. The roar of cannons and the crack of muskets shattered the old world and ushered in the age of modern war. The first to master this new power were the Ottomans. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople, the last jewel of the Byzantine Empire. For weeks, his cannons pounded the city's mighty walls, walls that had withstood centuries of attack. At last, they crumbled. The Ottomans stormed in, and Constantinople fell, marking the end of the Middle Ages. The city became Istanbul, the new capital of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. It was one of the first great victories of gunpowder war. Meanwhile, in Europe, kingdoms were uniting into powerful nations. Spain, France, and England emerged as central players. Their armies now marched with musketeers and pikemen, supported by artillery. Battles like Pavia in 1525 showed how firearms could crush even the proudest knights, as French cavalry fell before Spanish guns. The knight, once the symbol of war, had been dethroned. But war was no longer confined to Europe. This was the age of exploration. Ships armed with cannons sailed across oceans, carrying not only merchants and missionaries but also soldiers and conquerors. The Spanish conquistadors, led by men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, waged war in the Americas. With steel swords, horses, and firearms, they overthrew mighty empires like the Aztecs and Incas, reshaping entire continents. These wars were as much about disease and shock as about battle. Millions perished, and the balance of the world shifted forever. In Asia, the story was no less dramatic. The Mughal Empire in India, founded by Babur in the 16th century, rose on the strength of gunpowder weapons and cavalry. The Great Battle of Panipat in 1526 saw Babur's cannons and disciplined forces crush a much larger Indian army, opening the way for centuries of Mughal rule. Similarly, in Japan, civil wars known as the Sengoku period raged for over a century, until leaders like Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu used firearms and strategy to unify the islands. War was no longer only about swords and shields. It was about strategy, technology, and global ambition. The rise of gunpowder made warfare more destructive than ever before, but it also demanded new forms of discipline and training. Armies became professional, drilled soldiers rather than temporary levies. States built bureaucracies to supply and fund these armies, linking war to the very structure of government. But even as empires expanded, Europe itself was torn apart by religious conflict. The 30 Years' War 1618–1648 engulfed much of the continent. What began as a struggle between Catholics and Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire soon spread into a broader conflict involving nearly every major European power. Villages were burned, populations starved, and mercenary armies ravaged the land. Entire regions were devastated, and millions died. When peace finally came with the Treaty of Westphalia, it reshaped Europe, creating the idea of sovereign nation-states. The Renaissance and Gunpowder Age remind us of war's dual face. On one side, it destroyed civilizations, toppled cities, and enslaved peoples. On the other, it forged new nations, new technologies, and new ways of thinking. War was no longer simply the clash of swords. It had become global, modern, and inescapable. And always, the same haunting question follows: who won? Did the Ottomans truly win at Constantinople, or did their empire too face decline centuries later? Did Spain's conquests in the Americas bring eternal power, or did their empire eventually fade? Did Europe's religious wars end faith-driven conflict, or did they simply transform it into political rivalries? History whispers the same answer: victories are fleeting. The cost of war is permanent. The thunder of cannons in the Renaissance had changed the face of war, but by the late 18th century, a new storm was brewing. It was not just kings and empires who fought now, it was entire nations. The age of revolution had begun, and with it, war took on a scale and passion the world had never seen. The first spark came in the American Revolution. In 1775, 13 colonies in North America rose against the might of the British Empire. These colonists were farmers, merchants, and tradesmen, but they fought with the conviction that they were defending freedom itself. Skirmishes at Lexington and Concord turned into a full-scale war. The Americans, led by figures like George Washington, faced defeat after defeat, but with resilience and crucial support from France, they triumphed. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the United States as an independent nation. This war was different. It was not just about territory or kings. It was about ideals, liberty, independence, and self-rule. And it set an example the world would not forget. Only a few years later, another revolution shook the very heart of Europe. In 1789, the people of France rose against their monarchy, driven by hunger, inequality, and the dream of freedom. The French Revolution unleashed chaos, overthrowing kings, executing nobles, and tearing apart the old order. But revolutions do not end peacefully. Out of the turmoil emerged one of history's greatest military leaders, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon took the disorganized armies of revolutionary France and transformed them into a force that stunned Europe. He introduced mass conscription, the nation in arms. For the first time, millions of citizens were mobilized not just as subjects but as participants in a national struggle. His armies moved swiftly, fought with flexibility, and struck with precision. At battles like Austerlitz in 1805, he crushed larger coalitions of European powers, earning his place as one of the greatest commanders in history. But Napoleon's ambition knew no limits. From Spain to Russia, he sought to dominate Europe. For over a decade, the continent was consumed by the Napoleonic Wars. Cities burned, kingdoms fell, and millions died. His empire stretched across much of Europe, but in 1812, his invasion of Russia became his downfall. The brutal Russian winter, hunger, and relentless attacks shattered his grand army. From that moment, defeat followed defeat. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was finally crushed by a coalition led by Britain's Duke of Wellington. His empire was gone, and Europe was left scarred but reshaped. What made the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars so significant was not just their scale, but their meaning. War was no longer the affair of kings alone. Entire peoples fought, driven by nationalism and ideology. The battlefield had become the proving ground for new political ideas, liberty, equality, and the rights of nations. But again we must ask, who won? America gained independence, but slavery and division lingered. France proclaimed liberty, but drowned Europe in blood before monarchy returned. Napoleon's genius won countless battles, but left him in exile on a lonely island. Perhaps the true victor was not any nation but the idea of modern war itself. For the first time, war was fought by nations, for nations, and in the name of nations. And that would change the world forever. The 19th century was not just an age of factories, railroads, and inventions. It was also an age where war itself became industrial. The smoke of coal, the hiss of steam, and the power of machines began to reshape the battlefield in ways unimaginable to earlier generations. The Industrial Revolution gave nations new tools of destruction. Muskets became rifles, cannons became artillery, and ships turned into ironclad monsters powered by steam. Railroads allowed armies to move faster than ever before, while the telegraph gave commanders instant communication across great distances. For the first time in history, wars could be coordinated like clockwork, but they also became deadlier. One of the earliest examples of this transformation came during the Crimean War 1853–1856. It was fought between Russia and an alliance of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia. This war is remembered for its suffering. Disease killed more soldiers than battle, and the world saw the birth of modern nursing with Florence Nightingale. But it also showed the power of industrial technology. Railways and steamships were used to supply armies. The telegraph sent news of battles back to London within hours. The world was getting smaller, and war was becoming global. Then came the American Civil War 1861–1865, often called the first truly modern war. Two great armies of the North and South clashed in a brutal struggle that tore the United States apart. Rifled muskets and artillery made traditional charges suicidal, leading to horrific casualties. Railroads moved entire armies across states. Ironclad ships like the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia fought the first battle of steel warships. The war also introduced trench warfare, signaling the grim future of combat. By the time it ended, over 600,000 lives had been lost, and America was forever changed. Meanwhile, in Europe, the rise of Prussia under Otto von Bismarck demonstrated how industrial efficiency could win wars swiftly. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–1871 saw German rifles, artillery, and railroads overwhelm the French army. Paris fell, and the German Empire was born. A new power had emerged in Europe, setting the stage for the conflicts of the 20th century. This century also witnessed colonial wars on a global scale. Industrial powers of Europe carved up Africa and Asia, bringing modern weapons against traditional societies. The Zulu warriors of Africa, the Sepoy rebels in India, and countless others fought bravely, but rifles and machine guns turned the tide. At the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, British forces armed with Maxim machine guns slaughtered thousands of Sudanese warriors in minutes. The balance of power was no longer fair. Technology had tilted war heavily in favor of industrialized nations. The cost of war was not only counted in battles won or lost, but in human suffering. Civilians were increasingly drawn into the firestorm. Bombardments, famines, and diseases spread wherever armies marched. And for the first time, the press and photography brought the horrors of war directly into people's homes. The world could no longer look away. So, who won these wars? The United States emerged united but deeply scarred. Germany rose as a new power, but its rise unsettled the fragile balance of Europe. Britain and France expanded their empires, yet planted the seeds of resentment in their colonies. And Russia, though often beaten, remained vast and ambitious. Perhaps the real victor was industrialization itself. Machines now dictated the rhythm of war. No longer was battle the domain of knights, swords, or even muskets. It was the age of mass armies, steel, and smoke. And as the 19th century closed, the world stood on the edge of something even darker. Because the industrial age had built the foundations for a conflict greater than any before, a war so vast it would engulf the entire world. The year was 1914. Europe stood at the height of its power. Empires stretched across the globe, industry thrived, and science promised a bright future. But beneath this progress lay rivalries, alliances, and ambitions that made the continent a powder keg, waiting for a spark. That spark came in Sarajevo, when a young Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. What followed was not just another war between kings and kingdoms. It was the first truly global war. The alliances of Europe, the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire, dragged the entire world into conflict. Colonies supplied troops, oceans became battlegrounds, and soon every continent felt the tremors of war. At first, leaders promised a short, decisive campaign. Young men marched through cheering streets, certain they would be home by Christmas. Instead, they found themselves in a nightmare. The battlefields of Europe turned into vast networks of trenches, muddy, rat-infested scars across the land. Soldiers lived in filth, constantly under the threat of artillery barrages, sniper fire, and poison gas. The machine gun, once an invention, now became a symbol of death, mowing down entire waves of attackers in seconds. Battles like the Somme and Verdun consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, with front lines barely moving at all. Technology continued to escalate the horror. Tanks rumbled across battlefields for the first time. Airplanes, once fragile machines, became tools of reconnaissance and aerial combat. Submarines prowled the oceans, sinking ships and cutting supply lines. The war machine was fully industrialized, and humanity was paying the price. Beyond the trenches, the war reached every corner of the globe. In Africa, colonial troops fought battles far from home. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire clashed with British forces, while Arab rebels, inspired by promises of independence, rose in revolt. On the seas, German U-boats sought to choke Britain's lifelines, sinking civilian ships like the Lusitania and turning neutral opinion against them. The United States, at first reluctant to join, finally entered the war in 1917. With fresh troops, resources, and determination, America tipped the balance. By 1918, the Central Powers were exhausted. Germany, ravaged by blockade and internal unrest, could no longer fight. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. The war was over. But what had been won? The Allied powers claimed victory. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires collapsed. New nations were born, borders redrawn. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 imposed harsh penalties on Germany, demanding reparations and forcing disarmament. On paper, peace had returned. Yet beneath the surface, the seeds of future conflict were already planted. The humiliation of Germany, the struggles of new nations, and the devastation of Europe left wounds that would never fully heal. For millions of families, the loss of fathers, brothers, and sons was the only reality. An entire generation had been scarred, both physically and mentally. And so the haunting question echoes once more: who really won the First World War? Britain, France, and their allies claimed victory, but at what cost? Entire cities were destroyed, economies shattered, and an entire world order upended. Perhaps no one truly won. The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it became the beginning of a darker century. Barely 2 decades later, the world would plunge into an even greater conflict, World War II. But that, my friends, is another story. The First World War stands as both a lesson and a warning. It showed humanity the heights of industrial power, and the depths of human suffering. It proved that in war, there are no true victors, only survivors, and the echoes of history that remind us of the price of conflict.